Sometimes it happens quietly. A name you used to see everywhere just disappears. You scroll past a familiar face, and for a moment you feel something shift. The posts stop, the interviews stop, the collaborations fade, and in the comments there's a tone you can't quite name. Not anger exactly, not celebration either. Something closer to a collective withdrawal. You don't call it anything in that moment, you just feel it. Someone said something, or did something, or was accused of something, and now the air around them feels different. Lighter, maybe, or colder. You notice how quickly the distance forms. Friends unfollow, brands step back, colleagues issue statements that sound carefully edited. The person is still there, still speaking, still posting, but the room has shifted. The invisible room we all inhabit together. It's not a courtroom, there's no formal verdict, but something has been decided. And most of us understand the decision without anyone explaining it. We lower our eyes, or we nod, or we move on. It's worth noticing how instinctive that feels. Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. There's something ancient about that moment of collective withdrawal. Not the internet version of it, not the hashtags or trending topics, just the human part. The moment when a community decides, without always saying it out loud, that someone no longer belongs in the same way they did before. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's subtle, but it's recognizable. And what's strange isn't that this happens, it's that we understand it immediately. You don't need a manual to know when someone has crossed a line, even if the line is blurry, even if no one can quite define it. At some point the crowd shifts, and the shift feels moral, not legal, not procedural, moral. It's worth noticing how serious that feeling is, the way people say we can't support this anymore, or we have to take a stand, or simply I'm done. There's a language of separation, and once you start listening for it, you hear it everywhere, in workplaces, in friend groups, in fandoms, in churches, in political movements, in online communities that claim to have no hierarchy at all. There's a threshold, and crossing it has consequences. We tend to call this phenomenon cancel culture. The term itself is already loaded. Some use it as a warning, others as a badge of accountability. But if you set aside the debates for a moment, just set them gently down, what remains is a pattern. A person is named, a charge is voiced, a community reacts, and a boundary is enforced. That structure feels familiar in a way that's difficult to ignore. It raises a question that feels harmless at first. Have we seen this before? Long before trending pages and digital mobs, communities had other ways of drawing boundaries. In medieval Catholicism, there was excommunication, a formal severing from the sacramental life of the church. In Judaism, there was herem, a ban that could isolate a person from communal participation. In certain Protestant communities, members could be shunned for behavior deemed incompatible with shared standards. The Amish practice of Meidung carries its own quiet gravity, a relational distancing meant to preserve communal integrity. Even outside Abrahamic traditions, similar mechanisms appear. In ancient Athens, ostracism allowed citizens to vote someone into temporary exile. In various indigenous societies, social exclusion could serve as a powerful corrective. The details differ, the theology differs, the rituals differ, but the shape feels similar. Someone violates a norm, the community responds, belonging is withdrawn. What's worth noticing isn't the specific doctrine behind each case, it's the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. There's often a sense of contamination, of danger, of moral rupture. And there's also something else, something quieter, a fear of becoming the next one. Excommunication wasn't always about punishment alone. It was about preserving the symbolic boundaries of a community, about saying, this is who we are, and this is what we cannot allow. That instinct doesn't seem to have disappeared. It may have simply changed platforms. It's tempting to think that modern society is less religious than it once was, less concerned with purity and transgression, less bound by ritual. But is that entirely true? Or have the rituals shifted from cathedrals to timelines? When someone is publicly denounced today, the language often echoes older moral vocabularies. Words like accountability, redemption, forgiveness. unforgivable. There are calls for confession, demands for apology, appeals for restoration, or in some cases, a declaration that restoration is no longer possible. It's hard not to notice the parallel. In religious excommunication, the severing was meant to communicate something sacred, that the community's values were not negotiable. In cancel culture, the severing often carries a similar symbolic weight. It says, "We will not tolerate this." The mechanisms are different, the authority structures are different, but the underlying movement, the drawing of a moral line, feels persistent. At some point, this stops feeling accidental. Humans seem to organize themselves around shared norms, and when those norms are threatened, they respond. The internet didn't invent that response. It amplified it. What's strange isn't that people hold each other accountable. Communities have always done that. What's strange is how ritualized the process has become. There's an announcement. There's evidence presented. There's collective reaction. There's distancing. Sometimes there's a statement of remorse. Sometimes there's a rejection of it. And the crowd watches, participating in a kind of communal discernment. You could call it justice. You could call it mob behavior. You could call it social regulation. But if you step back, the shape resembles something older than the terminology we use for it. In the early Christian church, excommunication was not merely administrative. It was symbolic. It marked someone as outside the body, cut off from communion, from shared life. In Rabbinic Judaism, herem carried social and economic consequences. It signaled a breach so serious that relational ties had to be altered. In each case, belonging was conditional, not arbitrary, but not infinite either. Belonging depended on adherence to shared standards. That's still true, even in communities that claim to reject dogma entirely, especially in those communities. It's worth noticing how often the phrase, "this is who we are," appears during moments of cancellation. It sounds like a creed, and creeds have always drawn lines. This isn't to suggest equivalence. Excommunication involved formal authority structures and theological frameworks that don't map neatly onto modern online dynamics, but the human impulse feels continuous. We fear disorder, we fear contamination, we fear the erosion of shared meaning. And so we create mechanisms to protect what we hold sacred. The sacred doesn't have to be religious. It can be equality, safety, justice, free speech, inclusion, national identity, artistic integrity. Whatever a group treats as non-negotiable becomes sacred by function, if not by name. And sacred things demand boundaries. That's where the discomfort begins. If cancel culture mirrors excommunication in shape, what does that say about the nature of modern communities? Are we less religious, or simply religious about different things? That question isn't accusatory, it's observational. We often assume that secular spaces operate purely on rational principles, that they are free from ritual and symbolism. But when a person is cast out, the reaction rarely feels purely procedural. It feels emotional, charged, moral. There's language of purity and defilement, of cleansing and reckoning. There's even talk of redemption arcs. That's an interesting phrase, redemption. It suggests that exclusion is not always permanent, that there's a path back. In many religious traditions, excommunication was meant to prompt repentance and restoration. It was both a severing and an invitation. In modern cancellation, the possibility of return varies. Sometimes apologies are accepted, sometimes they're dismissed, sometimes the exile becomes permanent. What determines that outcome? It doesn't seem entirely consistent, and that inconsistency itself is worth noticing. It suggests that we are not operating from a single codified system, but from a shifting moral consensus. A consensus that forms in real time. That fluidity makes the process feel unpredictable. In religious communities, authority figures, bishops, rabbis, elders, often mediated exclusion. There was a structure. Today, authority is diffuse. The crowd participates. Algorithms amplify, reactions cascade, and yet, despite the lack of centralized authority, the emotional logic remains recognizable. Violation, outrage, separation, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes permanent banishment. What's strange isn't that communities enforce norms. It's that we're surprised when they do. Perhaps because we like to imagine ourselves as autonomous individuals, free from communal control. But belonging has always required compromise. And compromise requires boundaries. When someone crosses a boundary publicly, the response becomes public. Visibility intensifies ritual. In medieval Europe, public penance involved visible acts, sackcloth, ashes, kneeling at church doors. The community witnessed the restoration process. Today, apology videos serve a similar symbolic function. They are public performances of contrition. The format has changed. The underlying gesture feels familiar. Confession, a plea, an attempt to re-enter the community. Some viewers accept it, others reject it, but everyone understands the script. That's what's unsettling. We understand the script, even if we've never read canon law or studied ecclesiastical history. The shape of exclusion seems embedded in social life. Anthropologists like Emil Durkheim once suggested that societies create rituals not just to worship gods, but to reaffirm collective identity. The ritual itself binds the group. Exclusion rituals might function similarly. By casting someone out, the group reasserts its own coherence. It says, we agree on this, even if what this is remains somewhat undefined. It's worth noticing how satisfying that can feel. Not the harm, not the pain, the clarity. In a world that often feels morally ambiguous, a moment of collective certainty can feel stabilizing. Right and wrong appear sharply drawn. The community aligns. There's relief in that alignment. But there's also risk. If every boundary becomes absolute, the space for complexity narrows. Religious excommunication carried that tension too. Too lenient, and the community dissolves. Too strict, and it fractures. Modern cancellation seems to hover in that same tension. Communities try to balance accountability with mercy. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they overshoot. What's interesting is how often the language around cancellation invokes concepts that were once explicitly theological. Sin, repentance, redemption, forgiveness, condemnation. These words migrate easily between religious and secular contexts, perhaps because they were never exclusively religious to begin with. They describe social realities. When someone betrays a group's values, it feels like a kind of sin, even if the group has no formal doctrine. When they apologize, it feels like repentance. When the community restores them, it feels like forgiveness. If it refuses, it feels like judgment. At some point, this stops sounding metaphorical. Maybe these dynamics aren't borrowings from religion. Maybe religion formalized something that was already human. Excommunication didn't invent exclusion, it ritualized it. Cancel culture didn't invent moral enforcement, it digitized it. The medium changed, the instinct remained. This raises a quieter question. If exclusion is such a persistent human behavior, what purpose does it serve? Not in theory, in practice. It reinforces identity, it communicates values, it deters transgression. It creates solidarity among those who remain, but it also isolates, it stigmatizes, it can harden into cruelty. Religious traditions wrestled with that tension for centuries. Some emphasized mercy, others emphasized purity. Some built elaborate procedures for restoration, others made exile nearly irreversible. Modern communities are improvising in real time, without centuries of theological debate to guide them. Or perhaps with those debates still echoing beneath the surface, even if unacknowledged. When someone is canceled, the experience often extends beyond professional consequences. It becomes existential. Friends withdraw, opportunities vanish, reputation shifts. It resembles social death. That phrase appears in sociological literature to describe the condition of being treated as if one no longer fully exists within a community. Excommunication sometimes carried similar weight. To be cut off from sacramental life was to be cut off from communal identity. The fear of that loss reinforced conformity. Today, the fear of cancellation may function similarly. It shapes behavior, it influences speech, it encourages self-censorship. Whether that's protective or oppressive depends on perspective, but the pattern itself is recognizable. Belonging is conditional. Conditional belonging requires vigilance. Vigilance creates tension, and tension seeks release. Sometimes that release comes through collective condemnation, sometimes through forgiveness. What's worth noticing is not which side one takes, it's how familiar the emotional choreography feels. The public naming, the gathering of witnesses, the moral framing, the severing, the possibility or impossibility of return. If you imagine explaining cancel culture to someone from the 14th century, they might not understand the technology, but they might recognize the structure. And if you describe medieval excommunication to someone scrolling through modern headlines, they might not resonate with the theology, but they might recognize the social dynamic. That parallel doesn't resolve the debate. It complicates it. It suggests that what we call new might be ancient in form, and what we call secular might still operate through sacred logic. Sacred not in a supernatural sense, sacred as in non-negotiable, as in protected, as in worth defending at all costs. When something becomes sacred, questioning it feels dangerous. When someone threatens it, reaction feels necessary. Perhaps cancel culture feels so intense because it operates in the space where our modern sacred values reside. Values like dignity, autonomy, justice. These are not trivial commitments. They carry moral weight, and moral weight generates boundaries. What's unsettling is how quickly those boundaries can harden. Religious history is filled with stories of excommunication that later seemed excessive, but in the moment they felt justified. That's the nature of moral certainty. It feels solid from the inside, unquestionable, even if time later softens it. Maybe the same will be true of our era. Maybe future generations will look back at some cancellations and see necessary corrections, and others as overreactions. But from within the moment, clarity often feels urgent. It's worth noticing how often we use the phrase, "they crossed a line." Lines are invisible until someone steps over them. Then they become undeniable. Excommunication drew visible lines around doctrine and behavior. Cancel culture draws visible lines around social norms. In both cases, the line communicates identity. This is who we are. The question that lingers isn't whether boundaries are good or bad. Communities without boundaries dissolve. Communities with rigid boundaries fracture. The tension between inclusion and exclusion seems intrinsic to human organization. Maybe the real surprise isn't that cancel culture mirrors excommunication. Maybe the surprise is that we expected a world without excommunication at all. In a society that often describes itself as post-religious, we still enact rituals of separation. We still create moral thresholds. We still experience collective judgment. We still long for redemption stories. It's as if the structure remains, even when the symbols change. Perhaps what we're witnessing isn't the decline of religious thinking, but its migration, from institutions to networks, from pulpits to platforms, from formal rites to viral posts. That doesn't mean the two are identical, but the resonance is hard to ignore. If you return to that initial moment, the scrolling, the disappearance, the quiet shift in tone, it feels less random now, less purely digital, more human. It's the same tension communities have always faced. How do we protect what we value? How do we respond to violation? How do we decide who remains inside the circle? And what does it cost to draw that circle too tightly? The next time you witness a cancellation, it might be worth pausing before reacting, not to judge it differently, just to notice the shape, the ritual, the familiarity. At some point, this stops feeling like a modern anomaly and starts feeling like an ancient instinct wearing contemporary clothes. If exclusion is as old as community itself, then perhaps the conversation isn't about whether it should exist, but about how consciously we practice it. That's not an answer. Just an observation. We've always drawn lines. We've always feared crossing them. We've always feared being on the wrong side. Maybe what's strange isn't that cancel culture mirrors excommunication. Maybe what's strange is that we thought we had left excommunication behind. If this raised something for you, an agreement, a disagreement, or even just a question, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Not answers, just what this brought up for you. I read them. And if this kind of slow reflection feels valuable to you, you can subscribe, like, or share the video. It helps the channel grow, but only if it genuinely resonates with you.